Hello, everybody. Uh, hey, Freddie. Hey, Nikita. How's it going?
Good, how about you?
Not bad. Let me go ahead and I just need to make an adjustment to the audio, and that's much better. Okay. So really to this week is a kind of transitional week for for assignments. We have the paper that's due on Sunday, and then of course you know about the annotated bibliography that's going to be coming up the following week. The outline will be due shortly thereafter. I'll be providing information with that tomorrow. So keep an eye on that. So that'll get posted along with a pretty lengthy lecture and explanation video for that material. So really what I wanted to do is kind of open the floor now to questions about basically the home stretch. You at this point have the annotated bibliography, the outline, the presentation, and the final. And the nice thing about those is all four of them are related, and all of the work towards one will help you organize and be prepared for the others. As you've noticed from the graph, from the flow chart for the assignment flow chart. So I really just kind of want to answer your questions and any other questions that you might have, even if you might know the answer. For those of you, for those watching on YouTube later, I'm sure that'll be helpful. So I'm just going to open up the floor to you two.
I know this may sound like a dumb question, but can you walk us through the flow chart? Because when I look at it myself, I get kind of uh, lost with the different like arrows pointing everywhere.
Absolutely. I'll be more than happy to do that.
Thank you, I
Uh,
appreciate it.
let me go ahead and grab that. And let me know if you see this.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what's going on. So you're looking, so here's the class in a nutshell. This is essentially what the class is. And you notice that when the controversial research topic, right? You notice that there's a through line through all of the assignments. And the reason that is because everything you do is based off of the controversial research topic you chose weeks ago, or and at this point, like a month and a half, 2 months ago. So you're going to do you did your hot newspaper, and you did an analysis of that. And so that's cool. That's kind of its self-contained thing. You notice that nothing's really connecting to this. But what is connecting is the sources. You notice that the blue stuff, that when anything regarding to sources is blue. And you got 3 newspaper sources for that. Well, those 3 newspaper sources can be banked towards the 10 source minimum that you have for the annotated bibliography. Then you also notice that you then did a journal article analysis that is getting turned in by Sunday. And you looked up on the minimum, you looked up 3 journal sources. So those are also banked into this 10 source minimum, 5 newspapers and 5 journal articles. So what does this mean? So first off, you have an annotated bibliography that you're going to do that will be based off of this 10 source minimum. And you notice that these 10 sources are also a through line with the bibliography, the outline, the presentation, and the final. So all of the work that you did up here is now going to be applicable towards these over here. And the work you do for one is then influences the work you do for the next assignment. So now that so once you've gotten all of your sources together, your minimum sources, you can have more if you'd like. But now that you're going to go ahead and do the annotated bibliography, which will just be a bibliography with source with a small summary for each one of the sources to detail what they are. And then the intent of that assignment. So right here, where it says assignment intent, this is what the purpose of all of this is and what you're supposed, and why are we doing this in the first place? So that's why I have assignment intent, basically explaining like, why am I having you do this? So the annotated bibliography, once you do that, you'll have completed your research index. So you'll have your research for your final and all of the other related assignments. That'll be done. Then you're going to go to your outline. And then what we're doing now is we're going to start putting together the outline for the final paper. And subsequently, also the presentation runs off of the same outline and structure. So as you're outlining for your final, you're actually doing all the groundwork for what your presentation will be. You're basically creating the slides for your presentation before you make your presentation, because the outline will basically, you translate your outline to your presentation. And the presentation, so the outline will, and the intent will be the organization of the final paper, which is why I have a whole lecture about like how to organize it, how is it structured. You'll get to see like I have a like a paragraph by paragraph, section by section explanation of what each paragraph does of the final in each section. And then I also have several example papers of a 100% final, of a 100 out of 100 final. And then the organization of the final paper. Then once you do that, then we'll be getting into our presentations, which will be the last 2 weeks of the course. And so it'll be the first 2 weeks, it'll be like the second and third week of May. And that acts as an oral rough draft of the paper, because what happens is that I intentionally create like a 5 to 6 day buffer between the last presentation and the day of the final. That means that by the time everybody does presentations, I'll have already given feedback on what's missing, what's good, what's, what maybe can be moved around. So the presentation acts as kind of like an oral rough draft of the final. Now, in the presentation, as I'll explain when we get to the presentation lecture in about a week and a half, this is what should happen. This is the assignment intent for the presentation. Is there's this whole thing I've told you, I don't want any commentary. I don't want you to give me the, the opinion or projection of what you think should happen in regards to Planned Parenthood funding or gun control or DACA or what have you. The presentation is your opportunity to actually tell me, what do you think is going to happen and what should happen? And so the distinction between the presentation and the final will be, the presentation is what should happen. And you get to basically create an argument based off of the evidence provided, the evidence that you've been able to accumulate. The final paper is what will happen. So take DACA, for example. Maybe you think that there should be, that the argument should be that DACA should be completely reinstated and there should be a pathway to citizenship, full stop. That's what you think should happen. In the final, your analysis will look towards what will happen. Like in reality, looking at all of the evidence, what is the most likely thing to happen based upon the evidence? And you're making an educated projection of what will happen in this topic. And this is where you kind of get to the grad schooly part of the final, is being able to make an educated projection based upon what is going to happen in your given controversial research topic. For those against DACA, and for those who think that DACA should be repealed and those that think DACA should stay, who is the likely victor of that debate and why? And so that will be the culmination of your analysis when you get into what is called the evaluation and critique section of the final. Don't worry, all of this will be explained. I actually have a step-by-step guide. So that is the class in a nutshell and where we're going from here. So with that, let me go ahead and just open up the floor then to more questions. And what do you think?
Yeah, it makes sense now, because I was just confused on all the boxes and then like the lines just going everywhere. So yeah, it makes sense now. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Nikita, what do you think?
It's good. I'm confused with what week we're in. Are we in week 12 already?
We're in week 12, yeah. Because it's I believe it's 18 weeks is the new semester.
It's 16 weeks.
Is it 16? There we go. Yeah. So we have approximately we have these 4 weeks. So we have 12, 13, 14. I think I'm not including the week of the finals. I think I'm acting a week ahead.
So just to make sure, you said we're in week 12, but we're still doing the week 11 assignments?
Well, I pushed forward the week. So this week is kind of a setup week because we have the journal article that's due, and then I'm also giving prep work for the annotated bibliography that's coming up the following week. That's why I gave all that information. So this week is finishing up one assignment and getting ready and and then starting on the next one. That's why I'm kind of not pushing it too much by like, I didn't want to dump too much at once, particularly because this is like our next phase, and once we get into it, that'll be the next thing. I could have just mislabeled it. I do my best to try and make sure that I'm putting dates when you click on the weeks to show like it's from this day to this day.
I was seeing the due dates because it does say the due dates and the time it's due by, but I was just getting confused with the amount of work we have.
Yeah, the amount of work at this point is relatively minimal because the thing is that each one of these, like when we get to the final, everything, all your prep work for the final will have been done.
Okay.
The annotated bibliography, the outline, and the presentation are all at the minimum 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 weeks before the final. Because I have the final due, I push the day of the final as late as possible to kind of get out of your way for the rest of your assignments, because it really doesn't matter to me if I get it on the first day of the finals week or the last day of the finals week. But it matters a lot to you guys if if my paper's due on a Wednesday or a Friday, because you guys have other things to do. So what I do is I always make sure that my paper is due the Friday of finals week. So like the last weekday of finals week is when I have the paper due. That way I have over the weekend to go ahead and grade them, and then grades are due by Tuesday.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah, so I try and do that because I know that you guys have other stuff, and for me to have the paper one day later or 2 days later is not a big deal, but for you, I'm sure, an extra day on something else that you can put your energy towards, I'm sure means a lot. And then I just kind of want to open up the floor to like the annotated bibliography. Have you guys, seen the explanation video of it? Is there any questions about it? This is kind of the next thing we're moving on to. And then on Friday, I want to be able for you guys to go ahead and make sure that you look at the outline video. Or you know what? Since we have the time, and I have you here, and then I can actually go ahead and have it as a recording for the rest. It'll be posted anyway, but I might as well do this now. That way you guys can get a better idea of the structure of the final. So I'm going to go ahead and post this up. This is about 17 minutes. And then on the other end of it, I want to go ahead and like get your questions and answers about the final and the format of it and all of that. So let me know what you guys think. So I'm going to bring this on over. I think this actually might be instructive. So I'm going to move this over here. And then at the end of it, we'll go ahead and have a discussion about it. And then you can let me know what you think. Can you guys see this? It should be a mesh background.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay. So when it comes to outlining, a good outline saves time. So the more work you do now, the less work you have to do later in terms of preparing and research, in terms of preparing and organizing a paper. And so let's look at some advantages of outlines. Why outline? Why it helps the process? It helps structure the paper. It makes sure to organize arguments and points of view. It makes sure to settle placement of sources and evidence so you can put them in a logical flow. You're able to do a visual representation of what your paper is looking like. And that ends up being really beneficial for you because then you can kind of edit while you're looking at it. And you don't have to write a lot first before you before you actually commit it to paper, you can actually look at it on your outline. You can move things around. You can change the logical flow of things, change the way that points of view or evidence or sources are placed. So it's really, really helpful. So let's look at a demo of this to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about here. So if we were to look at, this is our basic structure for like an introductory paragraph for your final. So you would have a declaration of what the topic is, the question trying to be answered or observed, and then you would look at two perspectives and their contributing arguments. That's why you have side A argument 1, 2, 3, side B argument 1, 2, 3. And so you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, okay, that's all cool and all, but like, how does that look in practice? Well, let me go ahead and show you. So let's look at the question of, should the United States force tech companies to implement encryption backdoors? Okay, interesting question. So let's look at the two positions that are being observed and what are the arguments for each. So encryption backdoors should be implemented. Well, the arguments there are, it aids terrorism investigations, empowers law enforcement, and acts as a deterrent. Or encryption backdoor should not be implemented because of security vulnerabilities, violates right to privacy, and international implications. Now you notice I'm not adding any more detail, because when it comes to your introduction, it should be relatively short. An introduction shouldn't be more than about 5 or 7 sentences, 5 or 7 pages. Could you imagine? It shouldn't be more than about 5 or 7 sentences. It's just an appetizer. It's giving you some basic information in order for you, in order for the reader to be able to understand like what's the paper going over, what's the objective, and where's it going. And so that's why in an introduction you should just be relatively short and concise. So just so you know, there are those who think that encryption backdoor should be implemented because they argue it aids in terrorism investigations, empowers law enforcement, and acts as a deterrent. There are those who argue that encryption backdoor should not be implemented because it opens up security vulnerabilities, it violates the right to privacy, and causes international implications towards human rights activists and political dissidents. And that's it. You're just doing 2 sentences that kind of list off what the main arguments are that you're going to be going over on each side. And then you'll go, the purpose of this analysis is to, analyze the debate over whether or not should the United States force tech companies to implement encryption backdoors. So it's a relatively simple structure, but I try to implore everybody to not overthink it. You shouldn't be having an introductory paragraph that's a page and a half long. I think there's this compulsion with undergrads to want to feel like they need to explain themselves fully in an introduction because that's, in order to make more sense. But the thing is, you have the whole paper to explain yourself. And so feel free to just make this a very short introduction that just quickly goes over, what the topic is, what's the question being asked, what are the perspective looks at, and what's the purpose of the paper. If you're able to do that, then you can move on very quickly. By the way, feel free to interrupt me at any time so I can answer questions or anything that you want me to clarify. So
when you say short, like how short?
5 to 7
I want to make it like 7 sentences?
Like 5 to 7 sentences, yeah.
Okay.
So let's look at some definitions. So your definitions paragraph doesn't have to be sexy. It doesn't have to flow really well. This is a very utilitarian and functional paragraph. What this does is it defines the terms, the rules of the road, the language that we're using. And so, term 1 definition, include a citation for you got it. By the way, the dictionary doesn't count. We'll get to that in a while. And then I just did 3 terms. It could be, there could be 2 terms, there could be 10 terms. Just for the sake of fitting something on a slide, I did 3. So you might be wondering how this looks like in practice. So if we look at definitions, things like encryption, the process of converting information or data into a code, particularly to prevent unauthorized access. Mansfield 2017, page 700. We're noticing we have the page number, so that must be a journal article citation. So the operating system, software that supports a computer's basic functions such as scheduling tasks, executing applications, controlling peripherals. Montez 2019. And then we have encryption backdoor, the actual, the belle of the ball, the man of the hour. An encryption backdoor is a deliberate weakness in encryption intended to let governments have easy access to encrypted data. Galore 2017, page 202. So, interesting question for you guys. Why did I say encryption first? Why is encryption backdoor the last thing I put, but I put encryption and operating system first?
Because if you don't know what encryption is, you won't know what encryption backdoor is.
Precisely. Very good. And so you want to make sure that when I'm talking about like logical flow of ideas and terms and definitions, this is what I'm talking about. And so I picked this in particular because it makes sense like this. For instance, if you're doing universal background checks for gun sales, right? Before you start talking about universal background checks, what should you probably mention and define first?
What a regular background check even is.
Yeah, exactly. What is a background check? How does that work? Who administers it? How is it, how is it processed? Exactly. So if you're going to talk, before you can talk about universal background checks, you have to define, well, what's a background check? So once we do our definitions, then we go into the history of it. And this is, chronological timeline showing us how did we get here? So I have like event 1, 2, and 3 with a date and description and a citation. You'll notice in the example I don't include a description for the sake of space, but this will give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So when we're talking about encryption backdoors, particularly the disputes between FBI and Apple, you'll notice that the San Bernardino shooting was a big deal in terms of this debate because this is what kind of set everything off. December 2nd, 2015. I know many of you are still very aware of what happened. But then we go to the FBI Apple encryption dispute after the San Bernardino shooting to gain access to the shooter's device. And that went on for months over the course of 2015 and 2016. And then that died down for a while. And then after the FBI was able to use a third-party dealer to open up the phone. But then the Naval Air Station shooting in Pensacola, Florida last year kind of reopened the debate again between the FBI and Apple and kind of the tech industry writ large. So that's where this is kind of bubbling up. So you notice that in the history, we're trying to set up, what are the events that got us to this place? You might think like, if you're talking about like the gun debate, for instance, in for like, gun control, universal background checks or something like that, you might want to talk about Lyndon B. Johnson's 1965 Gun Control Act, the Brady Bill in the late 80s after the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, and then probably like the assault weapons ban in the 90s under Clinton. And then once we've set up our once we've introduced the topic, we've defined the rules of the road, we've set up the history of how this debate got to where it is. Now we actually look at the arguments. So side A, argument 1, evidence or quote, and then your citation, and then and so on and so forth. So let's look at this in practice. So encryption backdoors should be implemented. While this aids terrorism investigations, the FBI has argued that access to terrorism suspects' devices can prevent attacks. Hunt, 2018, page 144. Or how it empowers law enforcement or acts as a deterrent. You notice that we're going and putting in citations and paraphrases from different articles and different places, making sure to give attribution to the author. And so that way you're able to take, you notice that the the arguments that are being listed in A, B, and C are the same ones that we introduced in the introduction in the order that we were introduced as well. So don't be willy-nilly on the order when you do it in the introduction. Make sure that you are respectively putting them in the order in which you want to address them in the paper. That way it's just more orderly, and it primes people to think that this is where you're going to go next. And then apropos, we're going to talk about the next, the other side of the argument, and then go ahead and explore that. For instance, like encryption backdoor should not be implemented. So we have security vulnerabilities, for instance, as one of the major ones. And in this case, instead of having a paraphrase or a snippet from an article, we actually have a quote. In the wrong hands, this software, which does not exist today, would have the potential to unlock any iPhone in someone's physical possession. Tim Cook wrote this in 2016, his open letter that he posted to a number of newspapers. You notice, hence the no page number on the citation, implying that it's a newspaper citation. And then we have, like, for instance, violations of the rights of privacy and international implications. And then we have another quote here from Sanchez. If Apple develops software to help the US government bypass iPhone encryption, foreign governments are sure to take notice, and countries like China and Russia have a much more expansive idea of what constitutes a crime. So we have interesting evidence to back up what those international implications are. Now, naturally, in your paper, you would kind of discuss and dissect what those are. And naturally, you're not going to have just like one piece of evidence for every argument. You're going to have multiple pieces of evidence, but like I said, for the sake of space, this is what we're looking at. One of these outlines, for instance, if you're doing them, is probably about like 2 to 3 pages. But if you think about it, if every single one of these is just a small line of text, you'll probably be able to blow through that pretty quickly. So we've discussed we've defined our terms, we've discussed the historical context, we've looked at the arguments for both sides, and now we get to the evaluation and critique. And this is the real, like, kind of line in the sand. Everything before this is fair game to bring in evidence and all of that, but once you get to your evaluation critique, all bets are off. You go ahead and draw a line in the sand, and no new evidence is now put in to the evaluation critique. You're just now discussing the implications of everything you've brought up. And this is like the real grad school level of doing this, because it's not just about, like, how you feel something should happen. Nobody cares. Nobody cares how you feel about anything. People want to know what you think will happen, not what you feel should happen. I feel that we should all get $1 million. That's lovely. Let's talk about what I think will happen. I'll be signing up for an unemployment check probably. So we have to be able to, that delineation between feel what should happen and think what will happen separates undergraduate work from graduate work. Graduate work is about analytical thinking within the confines of looking at the evidence and making educated projections on what should happen given given a certain set of circumstances. So if the status quo remains, if things remain the same, well, what are the conclusions that we can come to? What are those implications, and what are the implications of that? So if we're talking about if spanking should be illegal, what happens if if it remains legal? What happens? What does that mean? Or what happens if policy changes occur? Then what are the implications of that? What happens if spanking is made illegal? Well, what can we conclude from that? What's the implications of that? What will happen? And so we need to be able to take those into account, that we look at the data, we look at what the trends are, and we make educated projections based off of the evidence. And so if we look at this, here's one. If encryption backdoors remain prohibited, well, the conclusions we can make is that encryption backdoors will remain at bay while foreign governments are unable to exploit American precedent. However, the implications of that will be there will be difficulties in law enforcement compelling tech companies to assist in opening devices. However, if we look at the other perspective, if any encryption backdoors are implemented, encryption backdoors open the door for a new tech precedent globally, and as a result, foreign governments may use the precedent to compel tech companies to unlock devices that could put human rights advocates and political dissidents in danger. You notice the wording in there. It could put human rights advocates, may use the precedent. We're couching these in language that is is in line with a prediction. Whereas there's a higher confidence yield because the whether or not encryption backdoors are implemented, that is a hypothetical. We haven't done it yet. Whereas if we look at encryption backdoors will remain prohibited, we know what happens because we've seen it. It's measurable, it's observable. That's why the implications are there will be difficulties in law enforcement compelling tech companies because we've been able to actually see it. So it can be, there's a higher confidence, what we would call a confidence interval on that. And so this is what I mean by, what are the conclusions and implications? What's going to happen? For instance, if you're doing a paper on DACA, for instance, okay, that's all well and good if DACA changes and is reinstated. But okay, that's not the end of it. Okay, it's reinstated. What does that mean? What are the implications of that? What happens because DACA is brought back? What do we do with that? So these are the kind of questions that we have to think about. Okay, so what do we think of that? Any questions? I know that we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves by about a week, but I want to go ahead and give you an idea of what we're working with or what we're working towards, really. So I just kind of want to get your feedback on that.
I know it just said for the last paragraph conclusion. Can you go like explore more as specifically like what you expect for the final paper?
For the final, the conclusion usually is just a kind of a recap. Like if you're trying to go into like whatever, profound projections you're making, that's all going to be encapsulated in the evaluation critique section before your conclusion. All the conclusion is going to be is a wrap up. The introduction and conclusion are mirrors of each other. The introduction, you're basically just saying like, here's the subject matter, here's the debate that's going to be looked at. This is what one side of the argument says, this is what critics of the arguments say. And this is what the purpose of the paper is to analyze and dissect and give an evaluation critique of what of where this is going to go. In the conclusion, it'll go looking at after looking at the history and evaluation critique, after history and definitions and analyzing the arguments and giving an evaluation critique. This paper sought to look at the debate on gun control. Period. It's really, the conclusion doesn't need to be this big old long thing. I've seen people try and like put a whole bunch of ideas inside of the conclusion at the end, and the thing is like you can put that in an evaluation critique section without having to bog down the actual conclusion, because the idea is you're supposed to be in the conclusion, you're just wrapping up the paper. It's just so you don't abruptly end. I'm sure many of you have had gone through like a presentation or a lecture or something like that, and they didn't, just kind of recap what they went over, and it just abruptly ends, and you're almost kind of like, so wait a minute, what did we go over again? So the conclusion is just to go ahead and like, hey, this is what the paper went over, and this is what the point of it was. It's a really short paragraph, or at least it should be. Conclusions shouldn't be super duper long. What about you, Nikita? What do you think? Is there anything that you have questions about or something that you just want to keep an eye on?
I don't think I have any questions, but I did want to say that I think I was complicating it more than it should be. So like in the video, you did say that it's, not needed to be complicated.
Oh yeah. Are you talking about like just how the final should be or how the outline should be?
The outline, yeah.
Yeah, it's not super complicated. It's really, it's kind of a paint by numbers, and I actually provide, and that's why in the outline I provide you, in that outline presentation, I provide you like, hey, here's what it should look like, and then like instead of just giving you a root and just instead of just giving you like a rubric or a form of how it should look like, I actually give you a practical application of how you could put that into practice. I figured that would be an easier way of doing it. And outlining takes time. I mean, you're going to spend more time thinking than you are writing when you put an outline together, because it's more about, the point of the outline is about organization. And the thing you want to keep in your head as you're putting your stuff together for your final is you need to keep asking yourself, like, if I were to explain this to a human being, like if this was a discussion, what would I want to tell someone first in order for them to understand what I'm trying to convey to them? This goes back to like the second week of class when we talk about logical progression of ideas, when we're the lecture on how to structure a paper. And so that's the thing you want to keep in the back of your head. And it's always wise to kind of show your work to other people, to kind of say like, hey, does this make sense, or am I answering the questions that you may have in your head as it brings up? Nobody writes papers in a vacuum, especially professionally. Like before anybody sends it over to publication or to review, like a bunch of people have looked at it, read it, given feedback on it. And so, the way that you do your work at the university level shouldn't be any different. You shouldn't have to do your work in a vacuum. If you're not getting, if it's not just feedback from me, it's also feedback from your peers who may ask, specific questions to specific things. Particularly, it's really helpful when you give yourself just a little bit of time. You're not doing it the last minute. By showing someone your work, they may ask questions about like, hey, what about X, Y, and Z? And you're like, you know what, I don't actually address that all that much. Maybe I can grab like a piece of information or a source and just add that in. Many people end up finding out like, oh my God, I didn't hit the word count, so I need to write like an extra page of just BS really in order to kind of get to the word count. Whereas, and I've been harping on this since the beginning of the semester, is, write the paper you're going to write, word count be damned, and then see what you're lacking. Because instead of having, I'd rather have, of a 2,000 word paper, I'd rather have a 1,700 word paper that's finely edited than a 2,100 word paper that is bloated. And just because you're trying to get a word count or a page count, that, the 1,700 that's finely edited is going to get a better grade. And so the way that you do that is you write the paper you're going to write. You're like, oh, I'm like 1,500 words. Well, let me see what I'm missing, or let me go ahead and get some feedback on this. And then I can go from there, which is why I'm going to have a rough draft available for the final as well, like a week and a half in advance. I think I actually already posted all of this. Like the whole calendar is up for the remainder of the quarter. So that way you guys can see like just what the rest of the due dates look like and all of that. So if you go to the course calendar in Blackboard, it's all there. But we are nearing the home stretch. Oh, anything else? Any other questions? We're going to get more into this, by the way, coming next week and into the coming weeks as we're finishing up into the end of mid-May. Because I think the last day of the last day of this semester is May 15th, from what I understand. So we still got a little bit more than a month to go, and you've got plenty of time. And you have to think about it as this: it's like, oh my God, I have to start work on your final. Not really. You're already doing it. You're preparing stuff, and just because I have a due date doesn't mean that you can't start up on it and start thinking about it and organizing it and putting it together. So that's the kind of thing that I want you guys to be thinking about. Other than that, is there any other questions you guys have for me as we round out the hour? Cool. Well, I will go ahead and close up. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this gets posted to YouTube, and then I will have the door open from 5 to 6 to have office hours if anybody has any questions. With that, I hope you guys have a good rest of your week. Good luck on the rest of your journal article analyses if you have not turned them in. and get started in the annotated bibliography. Just fair warning, it's a little bit time consuming because you do have to actually kind of skim through and read the sources that you're going to include. That way you can actually put together a coherent short summary. It's only 50 to 100 words. So, I mean, I'm not asking you to like deep dive into each one of the sources, but at least like just know what's in it. Like that's the only thing that I really want you to be able to do. At least on a, top level. So with that, I will talk to you all soon. Take care.